Our name is Jonathan Meades, and this series is called Abroad Again. It lifts the stones of British building to reveal the life forms beneath them. Follow us down a B-road of discovery, down life's lonely highway of adventure. So, abroad again, for a time when mankind half believed that it had got it right.
Stowe opened as a public school in 1923. By the standards of such establishments, it was an upstart. So unlike Eton or Winchester, it doesn't own a tradition of piety and duty. And unlike the public schools of the 19th century, it wasn't burdened by muscular Christianity and the pursuit of righteousness through cold showers. It was not a religious foundation. Indeed, its first headmaster, J.F. Roxburgh, was described by Evelyn Waugh, whom he had taught at the very churchy Lancing College, as a liberal agnostic.
This was appropriate. Stowe, the school, might have taken its ethos from Stowe, the place. This was the domain of the greatest of the Whig dynasties.
That's to say Protestant, parliamentarian, sceptical, liberal, progressive, reformist, enlightened, worldly, socially alpinist, secular, sybaritic, and opposed to the Tories, whom they viewed as the party of the court. Stowe is a very grand house, one of the grandest of the 18th century. It aspires to be a palace. It's a boast, or an anthology of boasts. It boasts about patronage, temporal power, imperial ambition, mercantile acumen, taste, happiness, money, service to the nation. It boasts about aristocracy in its most literal sense, that is, government by the best citizens. Here is the apogee of the most English of visual and plastic arts, the created landscape. Yet in its scale and swagger, it is somehow un-English.
Stowe's park and gardens are untainted by modesty and reticence. Those attributes, supposedly the beau ideal of 18th century English design, are absent. I say supposedly because modesty and reticence are inverted boasts of those who have much to be modest about and those who have no pecuniary choice but to espouse reticence.
Exhortations to modesty and reticence are covertly coercive, like, say, the Beatitudes. The Whig version of history judges the past by the standards of the present, as though the present is necessarily wiser and nearer perfection. It preaches the inevitability of material and ethical progress. When a government issues an apology for the behaviour of a predecessor in a different age, it is succumbing to the Whig interpretation of history.
So when this historical method is applied to the Whigs themselves and to the Whig ascendancy of the 18th century, it emphasises their opposition to censorship, their opposition to slavery, their eventual opposition to slavery, their de facto secularism, and their opportunistic support for the Hanoverian succession of George I, and their contempt for the Catholic Stuarts and the divine right of kings, which was absolutism supposedly sanctioned by God.
There's a certain irony here, for Stowe is one of the few estates in England which might be taken for a creation of absolutism. This is hardly surprising. The Whig aristocracy, which governed Britain for 50 years from 1714, was no more shy of ostentation than were the Bourbons. The Whig aristocracy established the hierarchical quirk by which the grandest titled families seem posher than the dowdy, frumpish royal family.
The Temple Grenville family of Stowe were enthusiastic sinecurists and acquisitors. They married well. The men, in the immortal words of Lord Soames, got their cock in the till. Hence the family name changed generationally. Temple, Grenville Temple, Nugent Temple Grenville, Temple, Nugent, Bridges.
Like all triumphant revolutionaries, and they were the beneficiaries of the glorious revolution of 1688, the Temple Grenvilles accustomed themselves to the fruits of corruption. In his invective, The Task, William Cooper, who lived at Olney, just 15 miles and a world away, wrote of
peculators of the public gold, of ye who borne about in chariots and sedans, know no fatigue but that of idleness, and taste no scenes such as art contrives.
He must have had his neighbours in mind. Neighbours who were the richest family in the kingdom and perennial petitioners for honours.
Every generation they rose higher. Earl, Viscount, Marquess, Duke. Just as New Labour has fearlessly refused to deny favour to able entrepreneurs who have made loans to the party, so were the Hanoverians unafraid to reward deserving sycophants and their bankers.
What nobility means is your ancestors had the wherewithal to bribe royalty, that they proudly pandered to royalty. This is John Vanbrugh, the greatest of English architects, and the first of many notable architects to work at Stowe. His face appears haughty, intelligent, sensual, Epicurean. This is not the face habitually ascribed to garret artists who'll starve of syphilis for the sake of a pilaster. Great artists seldom look like artists.
What's all this about writers being sensitive?
Wondered Vanbrugh's avatar, Joe Orton. Avatar as a playwright, that is. That was Vanbrugh's trade before he was an architect. No architect ever wrote so brilliantly. No writer ever made such astonishing buildings. Vanbrugh was famously witty, famously affable. He was a member of the Kit Kat Club, named after Kit Kat or Catling, in whose public house it originally met. The lamb pies that Catling served were also known as Kit Kats. It was as much a conspiracy as a club. Its 50 or so members plotted against James II, successfully. Otherwise they'd have been traitors, not patriots. They comprised grandees such as the Grenville Temples, soldiers, writers. Vanbrugh's architectural career had been launched and would be sustained by commissions from his fellow members. Vanbrugh's work, like that of the wild men of the 1860s and the brutalists of the 1960s, is atypical of England, which prefers prettiness and elegance to dissonant drama and violent emotion. Even his decorative eye-catchers were undertaken in earnest. Of the dozen or so Vanbrugh designed at Stowe, only 3 remain, altered. Reputation, even the reputation of a genius, is no bulwark against the vagaries of fashion. Stowe is the creation of a collaboration between numerous artists, some of them born more than a century apart, some of them by no means friendly to their precursors. Vanbrugh's original dome on this rotunda was hemispherical, not segmental. It was more assertive than the later 18th century would allow.
By 1719, when his friend and fellow Kit-Kat Richard Temple invited him to work at Stowe, Vanbrugh was already internationally famous as the architect of Castle Howard, Blenheim and Eastbury, which he had designed for Temple's kinsman George Doddington. To commission Vanbrugh was a proclamation of ambition. Temple had his wife's brewing fortune to spend, and it would be spent on the patronage of great artists, even if they were, so to speak, writing left-handed and merely contributing to an anthology. An anthology is what Stowe would become, and the sum is far greater than the parts. Vanbrugh died on March the 26th, 1726, from quinsy, inflammation of the tonsils. Today, it would be easily remedied by antibiotics, which I'd say is progress of a sort.
He was out of fashion, and he was not universally mourned.
The poet-taster Abel Evans, famous for nothing else, wrote,
"Lay heavy on him, earth, for he laid many heavy loads on thee."
Temple was determined to continue in the spirit of Vanbrugh and not embrace the new craze for Palladianism. He retained James Gibbs to design these two pavilions, both subsequently altered. Gibbs was a Scot, a Tory, a Catholic, and perhaps a Jacobite.
Gibbs had, together with Filippo Juvara, studied under Carlo Fontana, the leading Roman architect at the turn of the 18th century. Everything about Gibbs inclined him towards the supposedly outmoded Baroque.
Yet his next work at Stowe, The Temple of Liberty, was an early essay in an idiom that was to become commonplace. It was an ornament with a meaning. Liberty.
Temple associated liberty with the Middle Ages. To the Whigs, liberty meant the exercise of power by the aristocracy and not by the monarchy. To the modern eye, the Temple of Liberty is an ironstone Caliban in stucco Arcadia. It seems deliberately gauche. The origins of liberal government were commonly, if hardly accurately, attributed to Saxons. Hence the carvings of Saxon deities, each of which gave its name to a day of the week.
Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday,
Medievalism came in many forms. This is in Vanbrugh's style, though it is probably by Gibbs. Stowe Castle is certainly by Gibbs. It's an exercise in disguising estate workers' cottages. It's both scenery and what was not then called essential housing. Temple eventually succumbed to the Palladian taste, and James Gibbs duly obliged him. Robert Morris wrote,
Gibbs may be said, most times, in dress to please, and few can decorate with greater ease.
This is not quite the praise it seems, for Gibbs' Palladian bridge was an imitation of that built by Morris's cousin Roger at Wilton House.
Architects don't plagiarise. Architects imitate.
This is imitation, whilst this, on the other hand, is imitation. It's not, though, on the originality of its ornaments that Stowe's uniqueness depends, nor equally on their architectural quality. William Kent was the third great name to work at Stowe.
He too had lived in Italy, supported by a variety of patrons for whom he bought, among other things, dogs. His main patron was Lord Burlington, the promoter of Palladianism. Well into middle age, Kent was best known as a mediocre painter. He couldn't do perspective, and he couldn't do proportion!
Neither England nor Italy ever produced a more contemptible dauber.
That was William Hogarth, who abhorred Kent's sycophantic progress. Kent designed furniture as opulently corpulent as he was. He connected well as an interior decorator. He was responsible for the extraordinary Royal State barge. As an architect, he was usually a conventional adherent to the precepts of his patron Burlington.
But now and again he abandoned Palladian principle and designed with a certain flair. Like Gibbs, Kent had observed in Italy that monuments to the great were not the work of masons, but were undertaken by fashionable designers. And so Kent discovered his métier. First, the making of jewel-like ornaments, caprices which may appear architectural, but which are not works of architecture. They merely borrow architectural mannerisms. Second, the making of an appropriate setting for them. Kent's determination to create actual landscapes and waterscapes was no doubt a consolation for his inability to represent them in paint. In excitable Horace Walpole's words,
Kent leapt the fence and saw that all nature was a garden.
these are large-scale ornaments. They're as ephemeral as stage flats, yet they have lasted for getting on for 300 years.
They exist in one dimension as the setting for a perpetual performance. Stowe's Park might be a cemetery. It may lack bodies, bones, wreaths, teddy bears, but it possesses all the forms associable with the great necropolises of the subsequent century. Père Lachaise in Paris, West Brompton in London, and above all, the Staglieno in Genoa.
Despite the lack of bodies, bones and so on, Stowe's purpose is nonetheless close to that of a monument. Not specifically a monument to the dead, though certain dead are honoured.
The Temple of British Worthies was one of Kent's jeux d'esprit, yet it purports to a gravity of purpose. It pays tribute to
a sacred band of princes, patriots, bards and sages.
That, anyway, is what the Duff poet Gilbert West wrote. Stowe was a magnet for Duff poets.
This band comprises those whom Temple considered the makers of the nation. Privateers and dogs are included, but there's no place for priests who were held in contempt. This is unsurprising. Stowe is an agglomeration of monuments whose sum is a grand monument to the Whig world view, the Enlightenment view, which was that learning and education would inevitably spell the end of religion, that mankind, having progressed from polytheism to monotheism, would sooner rather than later junk mumbo-jumbo and cretinous superstitions and a half-witted belief in the divine. Here, 4 centuries before Christ, is Hippocrates.
People believe epilepsy to be divine because they do not understand its causes. One day we shall understand its causes, and then we shall no longer believe that it's divine. The same goes for everything else in the universe.
Such sane optimism would prove ill-founded. An appetite for the irrational, of which religion is a lazy, simple-minded expression, is seldom to be suppressed. As though to prove it, Stowe's garden is itself founded in a variety of conceits that are patently irrational. This is not the hate-filled, coercive irrationality of what are preposterously dignified as the Great Faith. No act of genocide was ever committed because of adherence to the English cult of Augustan landscape. The great end of all human industry was, according to the philosopher David Hume, the attainment of happiness. Part of that industry was the exhortation to the classical past to inhabit the democratic imperial British present, specifically the past of the Roman Emperor Augustus. The 18th century's indebtedness to classical precedent is nowhere made more explicit than at Stowe. The easy acquaintance with the classics of all educated people, in fact a tiny fraction of a still predominantly illiterate populace, was taken for granted. Acquaintance, that is, with classical literature, Greek myths and monsters, Roman history, Etruscan symbols, the sites that constituted the Grand Tour, and ancient languages.
Sine ille scientia, quae tantum quinquaginta annis abinc non rara fuisit, otos de Stowe solis oculis frui possumus. Videmus, sed vix intelligimus quod narrant nobis. Egemus subtitulis.
Even with subtitles, there is no consensus about the meaning. It was a matter for humane dispute, David Hume.
Truth springs from argument among friends.
Indeed, Stowe might even have been created for that very purpose. The garden, like any other work of art, was susceptible to multiple interpretations. Long before the park was complete, it became a tourist attraction. Stowe was the first such place to have a guidebook devoted to it. The park is literary. It has to be read. It is then precursive conceptual art, which is only completed by a text in an evidently different medium. It further presages the way that we're liable to see buildings today.
The increased mobility of the past half-century has occasioned an industry in architectural guidebooks. The knowledge we glean from them lessens the possibility of serendipitous surprise. But Stowe's art demands knowledge of the classical world and of contemporary thought about landscape.
Nature, and the imitation of nature, was a subject that recurred so often in 18th century verse that it became a convention.
Beauty is no quality in things themselves. It exists merely in the mind that contemplates them.
This is David Hume again, asserting mankind's primacy at the center of the universe. Landscape is created by the act of viewing it, which must be learned. Comprehension of the gardens depends on a combination of perceptions. Sight is not the only sense that comes into play. These gardens are an illusion which is more than seen. This is a three-dimensional set that is to be multiply experienced.
It was sense around avant la lettre. It was interactive before that word was coined. Its audience entered physically and cognitively and was enveloped, was wittingly subsumed, was snugly incarcerated, and yet was all the while aware of its artifice. The stone is fictional stone, a simulacrum. It's stucco, which was originally incised to resemble ashlar stone blocks.
It's as English as beer. Like beer, it was reliant on gypsum. Like beer, it was developed in the Trent Valley. Stucco is a smooth mask that rough bricks wear. The spectator would have been aware of the stucco mask just as he knows that the Cyclops is an actor wearing a rubber mask. A sort of suspension of disbelief is demanded. The garden is a game, and games are vicious. Political warfare by plastic means.
Horace Walpole, who wrote the Gothic novel The Castle of Otranto, and who built the Gothic villa Strawberry Hill, had no cause to admire Stowe. Temple so detested his father, the Prime Minister, Sir Robert Walpole, that he commissioned a statue of him to be placed in the Temple of Modern Worthies, which stood here. It was a headless statue. It long ago disappeared. It was built as a ruin to signify the moral dereliction of contemporary politicians. But it was Horace Walpole aesthete rather than Horace Walpole loyal son who wrote,
He had no patience at building and planting a satire.
He was correct. Lessons in stone are condemned to repeat themselves infinitely.
It was again the aesthete Walpole who wrote admiringly of Stowe that
Every journey is made through a succession of pictures.
He was this time not quite correct. However much Stowe's landscape may derive from pictures, itself evidently is not a picture. The gulf between similar and the same is chasmic. The very idea of subject is vitiated here, for the spectator is no longer a spectator gazing at something apart, but is within the landscape, an adornment of it, a blot on it.
the eye cannot shift to a blank wall outside the painting's frame in order to relieve illusion's pressure. This landscape is spatially inescapable. It is the gentlest of mental traps, but a mental trap nonetheless. Here are two paradoxes. The one is about epoch, the second about place. Stowe seeks to persuade us of the rectitude of the ancient world, as conceived of by the 18th century, and of the rectitude of Aegean temples and Roman rotundas transported to a temperate climate, to muted light. It is successful in both endeavours. We receive as potent a sensation of the ancient world here as we do from witnessing remains of the real thing. The supposedly real thing. At Volubilis, Mourmbury Rings, Merida, Segovia, Agrigento. Why?
Why? Take the dysfunctional royal family of Minos, whose wife, Pasiphae, contrived a bestial relationship with a bull and gave birth to the Minotaur. Take Minos and Pasiphae's daughters, Phaedra and Ariadne. Take Theseus, who killed the Minotaur, his half-brother-in-law, dumped Ariadne and married Phaedra.
Why are these figures of myth so close by us here? Why does this place summon them more than immemorial columns beside the wine-dark sea?
The problem is that between the immemorial columns beside the wine-dark sea, there are salespersons offering souvenir T-shirts of pop concerts among the ruins, and there are used condoms and tissues and needles. These tend to lessen our feeling of awe. The 21st century insists on gate crashing.
Stowe evokes the ancient world because it's a representation rather than a relic of that world. It's the ancient world subjected to the exaggerations and selections of art. It's the ancient world achieved with Whig certainty, as it would have been had the Whigs lived a millennia or two earlier. And because we're aware that it's a self-conscious model, we enter into a compact with it as we would with any other work of art.
Stowe's capacity for illusion is total. The gardens and park retain a miraculous integrity. This is partly due to the care with which they've been restored and partly due to their remoteness and size. Anachronistic structures have seldom intruded. Ha-ha! The immediate gardens are surrounded by a ha-ha, constructed by Charles Bridgman in the 1720s. This is very obviously an earthwork, and it doesn't pretend to be anything else.
The garden it originally contained was formal. It was transformed by Bridgman himself, and then more rapidly during the time of Kent. Then, in 1741, Temple appointed to the post of head gardener Lancelot Brown, who would become known as Capability Brown. When Brown arrived at Stowe, he was 24 years old. He was not a man with a reputation already made, which must have been part of his appeal to Temple, who sought
someone free of the vanity and conceit which had rendered his former assistants disinclined to alterations upon which he had determined.
Brown was malleable. His decade at Stowe was an advanced apprenticeship. It was here that he created the template for landscape that would endure for almost a century. Alexander Pope's dictum,
"In everything respect the genius of the place,"
is routinely quoted to indicate Brown's method.
But Pope ignored his own counsel in his grottos at Twickenham, and Brown no more adhered to it than had his predecessors at Stowe, who created formal parterres and topiarized bushes so that they resembled obelisks.
On the contrary, throughout his long career, Brown imposed the same invented landscape on countless different places, markedly ignoring their supposed genius. Brown's landscapes are artifices which conceal their artifice, the trick of naturalism in any medium. So spectators delude themselves that such landscapes are independent of human intervention. This is to diminish the power of human imagination in favour of some greater force, which is itself, of course, the product of the human imagination. Hedges were occasioned by the greatest industry of the day, agriculture. To the Augustan sensibility, they were eyesores, regarded with the distaste that is today reserved for wind farms and polytunnels. Brown's creations were, in part, a reaction to hedgerows, a return to a non-industrial landscape.
A serpentine river and a wood are become the absolute necessities of life.
Horace Walpole continued acerbically,
Home-brewed rivers that Mr. Brown makes with a spade and a watering pot.
Brown was as averse to straight lines as Frank Gehry is today. His rigid formula included irregularly positioned dead trees,
irregular planes of water, irregular clumps, irregular sweeps of grass. These components result in a landscape that is douce and unthreatening.
Rather, they would one day result in that landscape. The gestation of a park such as Stowe's makes elephants seem like fast breeders. The artist works blindfold, so to speak, with materials, trees, shrubs, that he can only see in their infancy and must imagine in their distant maturity. It's an art which demands a furious prescience.
Whigs might have effected the abolition of slavery, but they were exploitative employers. Landscape required an army of ill-paid labourers. Tons of earth had to be moved to create effects like the Grecian Valley, an artificial coombe, a riverless valley.
Brown left Stowe to set up on his own in 1749, but the style of landscaping he had mastered would be continued here and all over England and subsequently in Europe for getting on for half a century.
What we see today still approximates to the creation that Brown would never see. It's sadly inevitable that Stowe's arcing lawns should invite golfers, sartorial cripples who require that the grass be cropped. It shouldn't be.
Before the invention of the lawnmower in 1830, the grass would have been controlled merely by scythes and by sheep. It would have looked more natural, a word which has to have inverted commas around it. The house today is largely that which Temple bequeathed in 1779. His motto was Templa quam delecta, how lovely the temples are, and he built more and more of them with an apparent compulsion, a glut that even a park of Stowe's dimensions could not coherently contain.
Stowe House is a viewpoint from which to gaze on the wonders of the park. Had glass technology been more advanced, you can be pretty certain that something approximating to picture windows would have been installed. Within the house, little remains that attests to the magnificence with which the Temple Grenvilles flattered themselves. Their identification with the Whig cause was such that their fall was as sudden and as rapid as that of Whiggery itself. From being the richest family in Britain in 1780, they were, by 1830, so riddled with debt that a series of house sales had to be held, culminating in one which lasted 40 days in 1848. Few were killed in the rush to buy a bargain marble bust. Victorian indifference to Georgian taste is suggested by the fact that that sale raised only £75,000. What remains is salutary. It shows that Stowe belonged to an era of supreme decoration, interior decoration and exterior decoration, which is different from belonging to an era of supreme architecture.
The house is the largest structure in the park. It is, or should be, the sculptural centerpiece, which rather than adopt the form of a temple or a grotto, adopts the form of a palace. But it's not much of a palace.
Whilst the garden front is of a piece, the north front is by half a dozen different hands. As Whigs, the Grenville temples were susceptible to fashions: architectural, agricultural, abolitionist.
Fashion depends on hope and on the promise that things will improve merely because they have changed. Oddly, the Grenville temples were consistently loath to discard last year's model.
The core of the house is of 1680. It was remodelled 3 times over the next 100 years in a variety of styles. The gateways to the forecourt, for instance, are Baroque, by the Italian Giacomo Leoni.
Beside them, Vanbragh's portico shows how absurd it is to classify him as a Baroque artist. Save in his great prentice piece, Castle Howard, he wasn't. He was thereafter of no school, or rather of a school which had yet to exist. His work increasingly prefigured the brawny, sodieux neoclassicism of Claude Nicolas Ledoux, made 50 years after he died.
Until it began to take its cue from Greek rather than Roman models, there was nothing brawny or sodieux about British neoclassicism.
Its most fashionable exponent, Robert Adam, was grudgingly appreciative of Vanbragh's contrapuntal collisions. He talked of movement in his work, the play of planes, masses, levels and textures, and the tension between the components of a building. But it was just that, talk. The effects he actually achieved were as insipid and as smoothly reticent as those of the Palladians. Adam's fingerprints are all over the design, even though it was twice altered by Giovanni Borra and then by Thomas Pitt, the Prime Minister William Pitt's brother, and thus Temple's brother-in-law's brother.
It was no doubt Pitt who decided that the figure of liberty
Should be modelled on the altogether admirable John Wilkes, who wrote,
life can then little else supply but a few good and then you die.
Maybe the amendments improved it from close to, but from across the lake, where the house is best seen, they make no difference. The south front is very long, but imagination cannot be measured in yards. Despite its length, it cannot disguise the fact that it's off the mid-Georgian country house production line.
The low wings between the 3 pavilions do not link them. Rather, they extend the composition. They render it centrifugal. It should be concentrated. The components should be integrated.
It is grandiloquent with little to say. It lacks vigour. It lacks go. Most of all, it lacks sublimity. The property Edmund Burke contrasted with beauty. He contended it was associable with a terrible magnificence in nature. This is something which great architecture aspires to incite, intimations of transcendence and mortality. Such buildings were seldom made in the polite hiatus that endured for 3/4 of a century after Vanbrugh, when English architecture was all beauty, temperate elegance and gracefulness. Socially admirable qualities, no doubt, but the anaesthetics of art.
Georgian architecture appeals to people who are scared of architecture. It shouts about its restraint. It suppresses emotion in the service of reason.
It takes civility to the point where it is desperate not to offend, a quality which is in itself offensive. Georgian architecture is the first refuge of the imaginatively bereft when they wish to demonstrate their good taste. The case of Capability Brown is telling. His architecture, which he practiced prolifically after he left Stowe, was pedestrian at best. His brio deserts him when he has to address the functional. It is as though his landscaping and parks were the creations of a different bit of his brain, of a contrary sensibility, one that throws off the shackles of rationalism and invents without inhibition. His parks were unlike any that had hitherto been seen. Like all great artists, he made his own genre. Stowe repeats the schism which afflicts Brown. The house represents an architecture of such languor that the Victorians, who revered energy and restlessness, considered it idle and decadent. But the camp temples, the fey hermitages, the bizarre grottos, and above all the hallucinatory park are thrilling. Age of Reason?
Later tonight, a conservation success story from Gabon. Democracy and ecology, hand in hand, in the natural world. And I'm on to.